Um, cool. So we can dive in. So, you know, I've shared some context on what For the Record is, a bit, but just to reiterate, it's a conversation series where we chat with music people, music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. And we've got Josh Dalton this week. Super excited. Welcome to the show, if that's what we want to call it. And yeah, we'll just kind of love to start at the beginning and hear about your story and when your relationship with music started, and then kind of work our way forward to the projects that you're part of.
Yeah, of course. It's kind of strange being on the other side of talking about it. Certainly when I started out in music, so much of what I was doing was talking to artists about their stories and their journeys, and it's kind of interesting being the other way and having to work out how I position my own passion for music when I'm so used to talking about other people's. But yeah, I guess my kind of musical upbringing, music was always a huge part of my life as a kid, being forced into playing piano and clarinet by my parents, which I didn't want to do initially. But then I think probably where I kind of became, I guess I'd say, like obsessed with music was sort of when I discovered the internet, really, and was discovering online forums and downloading Limewire onto my parents' Windows 98 and then uninstalling it so that they wouldn't notice that I downloaded a load of MP3s. And this is when they assumed that downloading Limewire meant that I was going to put loads of viruses on their computer. So that kind of early behavior of discovering music that way was definitely how I I guess forged my own passage in music. I think so many people, their early musical memories are inspired by their parents, which mine probably are, from listening to like the Beatles and kind of artists like that growing up, and the Lightning Seeds I remember. But I think there's definitely a point for most people, I think, in their kind of early adulthood, kind of in their teens usually, where they start to discover their own musical taste, and those are the ones that I think really stick with people and that you remember more. I think another memorable moment I remember was finding a website. I believe it was called CD Wow, like that. I don't know if it existed in the States, but in the UK, CD Wow, and it was like you could buy. They basically just had all the chart CDs, and you could go on and buy them, and they would turn up, if not quite the next day, but like 2 days after.
Wow. CD Wow.
Yeah, and I think at the time that was like pretty revolutionary. That was kind of probably 2003, 2004. And I just opened a bank account for the first time, like one of those like ones you can open as a teenager. And I remember going on and using my card to buy like Kanye West, which I couldn't have bought in the store because it had a parental advisory sticker on, but I could buy on CD Wow, and D12 and like stuff like that, and discovering that. And I think that's probably what kind of led me into then kind of an obsession with like early internet forums. There was one in particular called Dancing Jesus, named after the Simpsons episode where Homer starts a website called Dancing Jesus, which kind of started almost like an Arctic Monkeys fan forum and spread from there, and obviously sharing music illegally, and it was shut down in the end. But that was definitely my own kind of early discovery.
Cool. That's funny. It seems like a lot of the early days were trying to find ways to circumvent your parents' rules of downloading software and or not abiding by what I assume was like you can't have parental advisory CDs because they're too young rules.
Yeah, I think as well, I think that kind of autonomy of being your own like tastemaker, being your own music discoverer is huge. I think that kind of really was where I got the bug for it. And then it was actually from the forum Dancing Jesus, where I think I was 16 at the time, and I was posting on there under an alias, which I don't know, we could probably find somewhere maybe. And I just one day just kind of had this idea of starting a music blog. And I was at university actually by this point, so I must have been 18. But we got shown how to start a blog as part of our course where I was studying architecture at the time. We had to start an architecture blog, and we got shown how to set up a blog spot. And I was just like, this is really easy to do. And I was like, I'll just do a music one as well. And so I messaged a couple of other people on Dancing Jesus and a couple of friends from school. I was just like, hey, I'm just going to start writing about music. Do you want to join me every now and then? And a few of them were like, yeah, sounds good. So that's kind of where Cracking the Road started from. There was a guy on Dancing Jesus who did web design. He messaged me and he was like, I'll just throw you together a really simple website. I was like, awesome. I kind of hit probably the right point. That was April 2010. So music blogs were kind of exploding then. There was HypeMachine in its heyday. There was, lots of like, early online curators. Well, not early, but like hitting the peak of online curation, I think. So that's kind of how Cracking the Road was born, from illegal music sharing websites.
Yeah, a lot of things were, I guess, on the internet. What I'm curious if there was like a particular music that you wanted to rally around or start writing about, or if you could talk about like the first few artists or first few albums that Cracking the Road covered.
I'm trying to remember. I remember posting Chitty Bang really early on, their version of Kids by MGMT. I remember that was like a really big one. And the first few posts, actually, I remember just like, we would just share MP3s for people to download. And then SoundCloud kind of crept in and took that market, took that kind of, you didn't have to do that anymore. We got some takedown notices and stuff like that. So SoundCloud became the legal way of doing it. So it very much started out as sharing like stuff from SoundCloud and Bandcamp for the most part. I used to be really big on discovering stuff on Bandcamp, and I would use like the new upload page of Bandcamp and would just see all the new accounts being created and just go through and find like really interesting artists there. I remember finding a band called Pacific Air, or actually they're called Coco, I think, something like that. A singer called Eddie Front on Bandcamp, a bunch of stuff like The Nerd on Bandcamp. Just like artists really, and there wasn't really any particular taste, but I guess like pop music for the most part, like anything that had like a crossover appeal to it, has always been where I've found my home.
Cool. And then as you were doing this and like building out the blog, I know you said that you were studying architecture. What was happening in the background, like elsewhere in your career and your professional interests that brought you closer to music?
I think interestingly, I'd never viewed working in music as an option. Like when I was going through school and having the kind of career guidance that you get and all that stuff, no one ever said to me like, oh, you love music, why don't you work in the music industry? It was always like, oh, you do art and you do physics, you do maths, like, yeah, that makes sense to do architecture. So I think I've quite quickly realized as the blog kind of gained a little bit of momentum and I started getting other opportunities to like travel and to none of it was really earning very much money. It felt as an 18-year-old that I was doing something really great. And I think I realized relatively quickly. So in my second year, I actually dropped out after doing 2 years of architecture, and then took a year out and just focused on the website for a little while. So that was kind of, I definitely realized there was a point where I didn't see architecture as being my career anymore, and I knew that whatever I was going to do, it had to be driven by my main passion, which was music.
And then can you talk a little bit about how that started to manifest?
Yeah. So I think around that time where I was having thoughts about dropping, I started getting, messaged by A&Rs, labels, and, being like, hey, where did you discover this act? Like, why don't you come into our offices? Why don't you, that kind of thing, which was great. I think looking back, I was definitely quite naive about a lot of it. I was really happy to just to be heard by these people for a certain extent. And I think had I taken better advice, or had I taken more advice, it would have been to have taken a step back and worked out what I wanted to do before kind of throw myself at various things. But I started doing some bits and pieces initially for RCA at the time when I would have been 20. And then after about 9 months of that, I decided to go back to university. But that was I was on a course that was much more that was much less time intensive and meant I could continue doing the website and having the blog going in the background. So by this point, the blog was actually earning a semi-decent amount of money, enough for me to pay people a little bit, and enough for me to dedicate some more time to it. So I focused on that while I was studying for 3 years. And then, up until that would have been the end, like 2015 at that point. And during the time I was studying, I was continually having conversations with different businesses, trying to work out what I actually wanted to do when I left. And I think it's one thing to realize that, I wanted to dedicate my life to working in the music industry, and then another to work out which aspect of that I wanted it to be. And I sort of made a decision relatively early on that I didn't really want to go down the major label route. I had a bit of insight into it. I had a lot of friends who had worked in major labels, and to me, it just didn't quite sit with my way of working. I didn't see myself as like a junior A&R, an A&R scout, or anything like that within those systems. It just wasn't quite the right fit for me. So when I left, I went to join a management company called Everybody's, based in London. And at the time they were looking after like Mumford and Sons, Laura Marling, Jack Garrett, a few others in that world. So that was kind of my first time of like moving to London and kind of throwing myself into it.
Cool. And I'm curious, as as all this is happening, of course, the music industry is also evolving and kind of transforming in terms of like how people are consuming music, and kind of movement away from more of the contextual means of discovery, like like music blogs. And I'm curious to see your perspective on that more generally, and then also to hear about like how your modes of discovery changed and evolved throughout that process.
I think I guess I try to put myself in the present to look back on what we currently miss from that time. And I think the kind of the curation side of it is really lacking nowadays. Like, I look at some of those blogs, like, I never considered Cracking the Road as being alongside a lot of the kind of the bigger blogs, like the likes of Pigeons and Planes, and like obviously like Fader and the kind of more established places. But even some of the kind of like Disco Naivetes of the world, like blogs like that, played such a crucial role in the early stages of artists' careers. Like, getting a cosign from 2 or 3 of those blogs wasn't just good in terms of the audience it put you in front of, because the audience wasn't a huge audience, but it was an audience that could do a huge amount for you. So it was people in the industry. It was fans that were very lean-in fans who wanted to go to your early shows, who wanted to buy merch from you. The fans who want to go above and beyond were the fans who were, for the most part, reading music blogs. And so that really feels missing to me now. And that early context just isn't built for a lot of artists now. I look at how artists have to, like, the number of hoops artists have to jump through nowadays to try and build any form of story, and it's really, really difficult. I'm like, it's a huge cliche, but for me, like, music and everything in it it's about stories, whether it's the story of an individual song, whether it's the story of an artist across their entire career, whether it's the story of a recording of a song, whatever it is. And I very much saw the early curation and the early cosigns as being a huge part of that story. Like, I know that I could look back on certain artists, and I've never been a believer in thinking that I broke an artist, or that but I do know that looking back, there were certain artists where certain cosigns early on in their career helped them kick on to the point that they got to. And that definitely feels missing right now, and I see what artists aspire to, and it's a shame, because I think artists used to aspire to that. They used to aspire to the kind of very personal connection, the very kind of, when I post about artists, sometimes I get messages being like, where the hell did you find my music? Like, I haven't shared this with, kind of thing. And the equivalent now is, to me, is like an artist posting like an editorial playlist from that they've got on Spotify, and it's just not quite the same. It's not. Yeah.
Agreed. I mean, that all of that context is so important, and it's really been abstracted away from the experience. I mean, how do we resurrect that ethos today?
Yeah, it's really tricky. Like, I've considered it at times, and like the kind of equivalent now is the people, and I hate these videos, but that's probably the sign of my age. But the TikToks, the people are like, hey, if you like this song, you probably like, and they say 3 more songs. But of course, it's all sponsored major label content now. So like, it's just not as organic. That's not to say that a lot of blogs didn't used to do sponsored major label content back in the day, but there was some stuff that was more organic. And yeah, I don't know. Like, I'd love there to be a space for sharing music online and for being passionate about that music. I certainly see it as like as hopefully part of the next step of music consumption, is the experience level of it, which I think is kind of lacking right now.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I guess that's that's one of the things we're trying to accomplish here at Create Coalition. Just trying to rally people around sharing, discovering music, and talking about the ways in which it moves them and the stories attached to it. And I think getting that context really helps to create connection. But yeah. Okay, so today, I mean, how are you discovering music today then?
That's a good question. I think I have like certain trusted like ears. Like there's some people who I regularly check in with, and will just be like, what music are you listening to right now that you're enjoying? What do you anything you've heard recently you'd recommend? I find probably the best, and this is partly because of the type of people I work with now, but one of the best ways of finding new music is through producers and songwriters. It's like they really recommend, like those are the people who I think are the next A&Rs now. Like they're the ones who, they get given an artist by a major label off the back of a 15-second TikTok, and they have to try and write or come up with 15 songs that's going to make up an album for that artist. And I those are always trusted voices for me. I do use Spotify. Like, I'd be lying if I said I didn't. And I've discovered a lot of great music on Spotify. It's, I think it's still limited in terms of that. I do still find that I often get led down the rabbit hole of just listening to the same stuff again and again and again. But when I go out there to try and discover new music, I can usually find, the Fresh Finds playlists are usually pretty good and pretty consistent. I'm definitely not as good at scouring the internet as I used to be. It's partly a time thing, but also I think, partly an option thing.
Yeah, it's more difficult to find like, a discovery home without really investing a lot of time. Cool. Okay, now I'm going to transition to some like more specific music questions for you. Who are 3 artists of note that you've heard for the first time, like over the past, say, year?
I'm obsessed with an artist called Medium Build at the moment, who I actually discovered on TikTok, which is really bad. But I did discover it on TikTok maybe like, I think towards the end of last year, from like a track he was teasing with a little live clip. And that's probably the first time that I've been swallowed up by one of those like campaigns of like, hey, my song's coming out in 3 weeks' time. Here's the TikTok sound of it, kind of thing. And it still felt organic though. So I often actually use that as an example when talking to artists about like really good marketing approaches that feel unique, that feel like true to them as artists. Because I think he's an artist where he's built very well over the past like probably 9 months. I believe he's just signed to Ireland as well. And despite having been releasing music since 2016, I want to say, but so one of those where it's kind of a bit almost like Future Islands-y of like just continuing to put the work in, continuing to tour, continuing to write great music, and getting recognised. So yeah, Medium Build, I love. There's an artist from the northeast of England called Lizzie Asau, who I think is great. Were it not, that's ESAU. Were it not for like kind of anti-northern bias, which I think there is in the UK quite often, I think she would be much more successful than she currently is. And I'm trying to think another artist that I guess like one that I never thought I was going to be a fan of, and actually quite disliked her first album, but then quite like the new album. So I should probably include that, because I always like when an artist changes my mind. Which is Maisie Peters, who I'm just not a big fan of. But her new album is great, and is just full of really great pop songs, which for me is what I always look for.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Before I jump into the next question, a question from Mark. Where in the north are you from?
So I'm from Newcastle, which you can't really tell from how I speak. Yeah, I was born in London, moved to Newcastle when I was a year old, lived there for 22 years. Yeah.
Cool. I've never actually stopped in Newcastle. I've been like through it on a train a couple times, and I mean, it looks very beautiful.
It's an incredible place, yeah, and incredible musically. Yeah, Lizzie is, I believe she's currently at university in Newcastle. She's great, and yeah, really big fan of hers.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. In the chat, Mark responded saying that you're basically Scottish then, and he is Scottish.
Okay. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's very close to Scotland.
Yeah. Okay. Who's the most underappreciated artist from your favorite music decade?
Most underappreciated. That's really tricky. I think I've gone in my listening history in my adulthood, especially. I go through like periods of being obsessed with like certain time and certain genre periods of music almost. So I remember going through like a period of being obsessed with like late 80s, early 90s hip hop and rap and discovering that world, and then like kind of early 90s shoegaze, going through and being obsessed with like obviously My Bloody Valentine, Slow Dive. I guess from that period, I'd maybe say Pale Saints, who are incredible. They've got a couple of brilliant albums from that time. Yeah, from the hip hop stuff I mentioned, like maybe like Black Sheep. I don't know. I still find Beastie Boys are fairly underrated at times, and I'd include them within that as well. Yeah, I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to like music periods. I tend to get, when I discover one really great album from a certain distinctive period, I then just dive into a whole lot more and just become hooked. So
cool. Oh, that. Cool. Okay. This is okay. Before I ask this one, another one. What is a music community that, you know, be it a label or any other type of organization that you're particularly fond of, and why?
It's a tricky question. I guess I often think of like I think there's kind of different types of communities, and there's some that kind of form organically. I think going back to kind of where I started from, like I have a lot of really fond memories of the Dancing Jesus music community, and it sounds like a really strange thing to go back to. You know, it's kind of probably started 16 years ago, but it was born from like this kind of desire to share music, this desire to experience music together, and actually, you know, that period of time in the music industry history is kind of, you know, was vilified by those within the industry, in that, you know, it was people stealing music, and it was, you know, all of that. And actually, these were the most passionate, most supportive people on the planet, and they all wanted to gather in the same place, which was on, you know, in a digital space. And these were the same people who, like, I remember going to shows when I was 16, 17 for artists playing like often their first ever show or second ever show, and there was maybe only a couple of demos that were online, which were usually bouncing around on Dancing Jesus, and you'd chat to a couple of people in the audience, and you'd realize that the reason they were there was because they'd heard the songs on the forum, And the reason they were buying T-shirts and buying the first vinyl, I actually, bit of a side note, but I made a load of money like a couple of years ago by selling of artists where I just bought their first ever releases, usually because of being recommended it by Dancing Jesus. And I didn't really care about the music that much. And then I looked on eBay like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I was like, oh, these releases are quite a bit of money now. But that would have been me putting my hand into my pocket very early on in that artist's career and buying their first releases. So I think that kind of void hasn't quite been filled yet. The kind of internet forum hasn't really been replaced by Discord yet, to my knowledge. I know, like, I've seen some really great artist-run Discords and some really great community Discords, but it's definitely a slightly different level of commitment from a fan than what that was. I think I also have a kind of fundamental belief that people like doing things that are somewhat not what they're supposed to do. So in the case of like sharing music illegally, I think people quite like that. And the kind of community it spawns from that is almost like a byproduct of the initial action. But yes, I think that in terms of music communities, I think there's artists that I admire who I think have done a great job of building community amongst their audience, regardless of what I kind of necessarily think of the music. I think Fred again is a great example over the past couple of years. The way, I wouldn't comment on the music, although I actually quite like some of it, but he's done a very good job of making his shows feel like real shared moments amongst fans, like both in terms of the way the shows are put together, in terms of the music and the visuals, but then also the way that it's spoken about from him to his fan base, the way it's kind of cultivated and the way he's built it over the course of 2.5 years now of playing shows. So I see that as a great community as well.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love just to follow up a little bit on that. Is like you still seeing a void that hasn't been replaced by something like Discord or maybe like thinking about Reddit as another online forum home. I think the elements that you bring up, that like maybe it requires like a subversive aspect to a certain degree. I'm curious if like you think that's the thing missing, or what else is preventing that void from being filled?
I also honestly think it's like gluttony of choice. Like right now, I know that like when I used to share, part of the reason people would go to like a website like Crack in the Road, like to find new music, was that there wasn't loads of other places to listen to music at that point. It's like, you could go on YouTube, but it was very hit and miss. You go on a blog that you knew you liked, and you go on it once or twice a week and listen to a few new songs. Now, part of the reason I started the blog in the first place was that and it's kind of an ego thing as it is for anyone who writes about music, but that I was often the person in my group of friends where people would ask for music recommendations. And so I was kind of like, I sent it to my friends when I started it, and I was like, look, just go here and just check here. I'm going to post some songs that I like on here. And now I know that if I send music to friends, if I send them a Spotify link, a lot of the time they don't click it because like they have the options already there for them on a plate. Like they can go on Spotify and click on a playlist that's been generated for them, and it's probably not going to challenge their listening taste in the same way that something that I might send them perhaps challenges their listening taste. But maybe they don't want to be challenged with their listening taste is part of it. So I see like when you give people access to everything, you sort of diminish the importance of curation in it itself as well. And I certainly see that as being a thing missing. Like, I say it in basically every single conversation I have, but there is too much music. Like there's, like I don't know if we need like 50,000 songs being released every single day. I don't quite know if we need that. And that's not to say people shouldn't be creating music, but I think we probably need streaming services that that give a better experience of a more selective range of music, as opposed to just being like all you can eat.
Right. I agree. At least a way to differentiate between, people who are professional musicians who are spending a lot of energy and time and hardship, and rely upon the success of these and putting it all into the same platform as as the hobbyists. Like, at least differentiating between these different identities, I think, feels important.
Yeah, I think also there's like this kind of, I think there's a bit of like an unhealthy thirst for nostalgia. It is fueled by algorithms that, we're so people, like almost all the social algorithms are built to for the most part, for like 95% of the time, to provide comfort, and then 5% of the time to shock. And what that means is that like our Spotify algorithms do exactly the same thing. Like they provide the kind of endorphin comfort that you're looking for, but they don't really challenge most people. And we see that then replicated across so many different things. Like, I see it across film a lot of the time now. You look at, Marvel put a new film out every 6 months that is essentially the same rehash of what they've just done, but they just change a couple of the characters, but the stories are largely the same. Like festival lineups, I find, are the same thing now, that there's not the same challenging of tastes, or there's not the same like risk taken. I think we're starting to see the reflection of our screens being echoed across the way we live our life, which I think is a bit of that's maybe getting a little too psychological, but I think the days of like when Daphne and Celeste were booked to play the main stage at Reading and Leeds and got bottled because they were a pop act. Like, I don't think a festival booker takes that risk now. They'd rather have like a kind of washed up act who's been around for 20 years, but who people know, and that people will go, yeah, they'll look at the lineup and I'll go along and see that. Like, and that to me is a kind of a bit of a sign of how our appetite for risk and our appetite for something different is starting to be eroded a little bit by the safety of a lot of the kind of way that we consume so much of our content now.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a weekly newsletter, and that is literally what I'm writing about this week. This sort of aesthetic sameness that we're all sort of starting to drift to the mid of being cozy and safe, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, here's to trying to change that, slowly but surely, through conversations like this. And the last question is, you're going to a desert island and you get to bring 3 albums with you. What are they?
That's a good question. I think like Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division is my number one.
Cool.
I think that the album changed how I thought about music. It changed how I approached stories in music as well. It's a big part of how I talk about what I do currently, through Serenade, which is interesting. Like, I remember listening to that album. It was actually shortly after I did CD Wow, and was listening to D12 and Kanye West and a couple of artists like that. And then I discovered, I believe it's something online, and then I started going down a rabbit hole of buying older CDs as well, which at that point included Unknown Pleasures, and listening to it and just changing how I thought about music, how it could be written, how it could be recorded. And I then went and read a book called Touching from a Distance, which is the kind of story of Ian Curtis and of the album, and then kind of became hooked on that. And I think for me, as a kind of music romantic, it sold me on the importance of a story in music. And it's something whenever sorry, did I crash there for a second?
No, you're good.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's something whenever I talk to whenever I talk to artists and try and give artists advice, I always say, like, have a story, and that any really good artist, their story can usually be summed up in like one sentence. And for me, like a band like Joy Division kind of showed me that, the kind of desperation and the kind of overarching sadness of the story really can be spelled out fairly succinctly. So yeah, that's a long answer to say Unknown Pleasures.
That's an amazing answer.
Probably like my second one be. Second one, I'd probably go for Fevers and Mirrors by Bright Eyes. I wouldn't say I listen to too much Bright Eyes anymore, but that was an album again that changed my opinion on songwriting. I think the kind of but in a different way. The kind of, especially like lyrically, was definitely very eye opening for me. So yeah, and that album probably put me onto a whole load of other great songwriters from there, like Dylan and Janis Joplin and Scott Walker, and like a whole other like load of kind of very visual musical storytellers.
Oh.
My third album, probably 3 Feet High and Rising by De La Soul, and that, yeah, I don't know, again, just changed my perspective on things. Like introduced me to a whole new way of listening to music. Kind of sent me down different rabbit holes that I probably hadn't been down before. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great trio. Yeah, and I like the context that each of them is, you know, kind of transformational for one reason or another in your experience with music. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I definitely believe that like a good album, like one of the best things a good album can do is to try and get you to discover more like that. Like you don't want an album to exist as like an island on its own. You kind of, and that's one thing I find that does miss a little. That I do miss with like streaming services, is that I don't like the idea of like being suggested an artist based on an artist, because it just becomes like fairly bland. But I like the idea of being suggested an album based on an album I love, because for me, albums are better representative of a period of time within an artist's career. Like artists change their sounds, you know, like David Bowie in 73 is very different to David Bowie in 85. And yet when you listen to David Bowie and then look at recommended artists, you get like suggested artists that don't really match up. Whereas you could recommend albums off, you know, the Berlin years more accurately, or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. Cool, Josh. This has been really great. You know, really appreciate your time and your thoughts and all the context, you know, into the ways that you interact with music. For people who are listening, you know, where can they check out your work, your projects, get involved in any way? You know, what's the best place to do that?
Yeah, of course. I haven't really said too much about what I do now. So I spent like 5-6 years in A&R, initially at Everybody's, and then at a label and publisher called Future Kind, where we had a publishing JV with Sony ATV, and then we had an independent record label. I moved on from there and moved into management. So built my own roster of songwriters and producers. Like purposefully stayed away from artists, as artists are great but are not financially as rewarding. And when you're trying to start a business, you need to earn some money at some point. And so I kind of built my own roster from there, which I still have I still look after a few of them, including a mix engineer called Darren Healis, who's works with Sam Smith and Liam Payne and Calvin Harris and a bunch of other artists like that. And then just over a year ago now, I got put in touch with a Web3 platform called Serenade, and I started some work for them, which I've been doing now, since April of last year, which has been really good. We kind of have a slightly different approach to Web3 to other companies, perhaps. You know, we're more like a Web 2.5 company. Our main product, without getting salesy on it, is what we call a digital pressing, which is like, we view it as like a digital version of vinyl. which artists can create for free and sell. We worked with Muse to launch it, and I guess we did the Noel Gallagher album last month. We're announcing tomorrow that we're doing the Liam Gallagher album, which is in a few days, which comes out next week. We're doing Jungle, The Hives, and some other artists coming up in the near future. But yeah, we kind of have a slightly, different, as much as I love a lot of the Web3 world and those platforms, I don't really view what we're doing as part of that. The artists we work with certainly aren't Web3 artists. They're just musicians who probably don't define themselves by the way they release music for the most part. And yeah, so that's kind of what I'm up to now. I guess I'm on Twitter still as the username Crack in the Road, which is a bit misleading. But yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you for sharing. And I like what Serenade is doing. It's definitely like, an easier conversation as well when you're talking to artists, when you don't have to explain all of the blockchain mechanics and deal with the, whatever stigma they might have adopted over the past couple of years with crypto. So
yeah, definitely. I think it's like a large part of what I do is talk to artists, but who like I said, wouldn't define themselves as kind of Web3 or crypto artists or anything, but who are artists looking for an alternative way of monetizing their music quite often, and an alternative way of providing creative context to their music. And that's what I want us to do. Like our kind of overarching goal is to provide an additional revenue stream for artists through a deeper storytelling narrative, is sort of how it's summed up often. And we don't believe that an artist or the fan needs to have like crypto knowledge or anything like that in order to participate in that. So most of the artists, 99% of the artists we work with don't have a clue about crypto, about wallets, about Web3 or anything. They just want to release great music and give their fans a new way of supporting them, in a new way of finding out more about what they're doing. So that's our kind of intention.
Totally. Yeah, as it should be, like creating more ways for artists to be able to focus on creating music.
Yeah, I think I can maybe touch on this very briefly. I realize I've spoken a lot, but I guess my kind of driver behind it is when I was at a label a few years ago, and I saw a kind of slightly nastier side to the music industry in terms of the kind of deals that artists were signing, and often being led into signing, and that were leaving them in very difficult situations. And that's actually what initially prompted me to go into management, because I wanted to sort of ensure that I was part of protecting artists against that, or protecting creatives against that side of the industry. And the further I've got from it, the more I kind of realized that a large part of the reason that these exploitative and these unhealthy deals happen is because of leverage, and that artists it's so difficult for artists to build leverage in their careers now, because you can't build leverage at streaming services, you can't build leverage at live, you can't build leverage financially because basically nothing pays you any money anymore. And when you can't build leverage, you then find yourself in a situation where you're kind of pushed into taking the money. And that happens, so much, especially unfortunately happens to artists from kind of marginalized and more disadvantaged backgrounds, which often tends to be artists from more diverse communities. And that's certainly no coincidence. So a big part of very roundabout way of talking about Serenade, but I guess a kind of more deep part of the mission for us is to allow artists to build leverage early in their career. If you can sell a digital pressing, and you can sell 100 of them at £5 when you're only doing a very minimum amount on streaming services, suddenly you are setting yourself up in a situation where you haven't necessarily got to sign away all your copyrights in a very bad deal for a fairly minimal amount of money. And that's, in short, kind of part of what I don't think we're anywhere near that point now, but that's kind of part of what I want us to build.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I like it. You're that perspective, framing it like that, is an opportunity to build leverage for artists who have no other way, of establishing it today.
Yeah, it's a tough time for artists. Like I think I actually wrote out a draft of like I kind of want to start writing again at some point, but I haven't done it yet. But I wrote out a draft of an article where like I think the first line was like, "There's never been a better time to be an independent artist, but there's also never been a worse time to be an independent artist." And like if you can harness all the different tools, like the kind of really great distribution channels and the really great financial channels, you can harness advantage. It's the best time ever to be an independent artist, but if you can't, it's the absolute worst time. And I see it day in, day out. It's kind of depressing how short the lifespan of most songs are now. Like most songs seem to live for like 48 hours, and then it's kind of gone. And it's kind of deeply depressing from both a fan perspective and an artist perspective. And I hope that changes. And I hope initiatives like this as well will give people a space to share music and to be passionate about that, because a large part of what allows a song to live on longer is the story of the people that the song connects with.
Yeah, agreed. No, I would encourage you to publish that somewhere. I'd love to read it.
Yeah, I need to find a good editor. As you can tell from what I've said, my thoughts are very, can be very of the moment.
Fair. Yeah, well, cool, man. This has been really great. Thank you again for being here and for sharing, all of your thoughts and all the music with us. And a comment, yeah. There's a comment that's coming from Mark, who has volunteered me to edit the piece.
I think I probably need to do a lot of editing myself before anyone else. It's it's fairly kind of flow of consciousness right now. But
well, I would be happy to take a look if you'd ever like eyes on it. Just let me know.
Thanks. Cool. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on and for hearing me out.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. Thanks for being here. You're very welcome to hang out in the Create Coalition, share music and whatever you'd like as often as you'd like.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely will do. I cut my Discords down recently, but I basically removed all the kind of more Web3 ones. So
yeah,
I'll definitely be staying here.
Cool. I need to go call out. I've way too many Discord servers that I'm part of as well. That's on my to-do list to cut that down. Anyhow, well, thanks again for being here, and yeah, see you in here soon.
No problem. Thanks very much. Chat soon.
All right, take care.
That's it.